In this episode, I am joined by R.B. Russell, founder of Tartarus Press and author of the newly published T Lobsang Rampa and Other Characters of Questionable Faith, the first definitive biography of T Lobsang Rampa. Ray shares the life story of Rampa, born Cyril Henry Hoskin in 1910, who claimed to have been possessed by the consciousness of a Tibetan Lama. Rampa's books were bestsellers in the mid-20th century, and though debunked by specialists at the time, are credited for increasing awareness of Tibetan Buddhism and serving as the initial inspiration for the careers of several notable Tibetologists. Ray reveals the truth of Rampa's origins, his various assumed identities, his ascent to international fame, the consequences of his exposure by the press, and the surprising reasons for his ongoing popularity. Ray also reflects on the mystery of faith, the psychological payoffs from belief in hoaxes and conspiracy theories, and what motivates some authors to present fiction as fact. So without further ado, R.B. Russell. Ray Russell, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me along.
Well, I'm so delighted to be speaking with you today, principally about your new book, T Lobsang Rampa.
Ah, yes.
And Other Characters of Questionable Faith. And you kindly sent me this copy, Tartarus Press, your publishing house. Wow, what a beautiful edition it is. I was so struck by that. Tartarus Press, I think, are very known by those who know for the beautiful editions, but this one is so nice. Here's the inside here. And beautiful typeset and everything there. I'm just holding it up, seeing as we, book guys, we can enjoy that. And this is the first full-length treatment, biography of T Lobsang Rampa. Very fascinating character indeed, and we'll get into all that. And there are also additional chapters or sections on various other groups, what do you call them? Characters of questionable faith.
Yeah.
However, before we get into this, your story, actually, your biography and your own trajectory, it features in this book. And many of the chapters begin with some kind of way in which you interface with the story. So I thought we might start there, in fact. I know that you became interested in these sorts of things around 1980 with an RE teacher who opened your eyes to what? Let's see. But I'm curious, even before that, can you say something a little bit about the context in which you grew up, the family of origin, and then perhaps moving forward into how you became interested in these subjects?
Well, my family weren't particularly religious. I went to a Church of England school without realising. In fact, it's only recently I've realised that in non-Church of England schools in Britain in the 1970s and 80s, they didn't have the same sort of assemblies that we had. I was just a child, like most children, took everything for granted. So when we had sort of 30 seconds of silent prayer at the end of school assembly, for many years, I every single morning prayed that I would become bionic. And unfortunately, I didn't. And I realized that quite early on, you can't petition the Lord with prayer, as Jim Morrison said. So I think it was the first time I ever realized that I couldn't just take it for granted that there was a God and the Bible, but I wasn't able to put that into words at all until I think I was having these RE lessons with Mrs. Wilson, who had come along and had stopped the traditional lessons whereby all we did was colour in sheets of Bible stories. The idea of religious education until that time at our secondary school was very much, the teacher, Mr. Ovenden, didn't actually do any teaching. He just related a Bible story and we coloured things in. She was actually hoping to teach us about world religions. And I'm not quite sure why she wanted to do that, but it very quickly became apparent to me in my sort of my very basic understanding as a 13-year-old that if all these religions all had completely different ideas of the world, how it had begun and who was in charge, and they were so contradictory, there was a good chance that maybe most of them were wrong. It was very, very basic reasoning. But at the same time, I was starting to read ghost stories and horror stories. And it was fascinating how in the more disreputable second-hand bookshops, I would go in and walk past the fiction section where the sensible books were, through to short stories and genre fiction. And that would then merge into kind of mind, body, and spirit and new age and sort of diet, fad diets and things like that. And the shopkeeper would never bother to shelve things properly, and they're getting a mess. And I started finding books by people like Lobsang Rampa, um, and realizing that there was some very odd belief systems out there. There's some very sensible belief systems I knew nothing about, but some very odd ones. And they all had this sort of thing in common, which I could never get my head around, and that was faith. Believing in something that wasn't tangible, that wasn't obviously there, that couldn't be proved. And I think to this day, I'm still trying to get my head around what faith is and why people have it. I understand why, probably from Mrs. Wilson, thank you, Mrs. Wilson, that most people who have a religion or a faith, they have it because that's the culture in which they've been brought up, and they've had no reason to question it. I think most teenagers do go through a phase of questioning, and a lot of people leave that faith behind. But for most people, I think we're hardwired as humans to want to understand the world. And religion has always been there to try and explain the world to people, albeit, maybe a few thousand years ago, or even a few hundred years ago, we had an improper understanding of the world around us, and we've learnt so much more. And it strikes me that many faiths have been able to take on board, scientific facts that we're now certain of. What I can't understand is why certain religions and faiths deny scientific facts, which are uncontrovertible or incontrovertible. We know that the earth cannot possibly be hollow. And yet, I was reading Lobsang Rampa, especially in this book, telling me all about the hollow earth and the hollow moon. And presumably people believe this. And over the years, I have come across those people. And the advent of the internet has been, very eye-opening, to see people putting up Lobsang Rampa websites and discussing all the things that he discusses very seriously. I'm still trying to, I suppose the book that I've just written was trying to understand that. And I've got to the end of the book and I understand just as little as I ever did in the first place, I think. But it's been fascinating as a process.
You did undergo something of a change of opinion. However, some sort of insight you describe in the book that was a consequence of having written it. I wonder if you might say a little bit about that.
Um, I think I am less dogmatic. I think as a 13-year-old, I just thought most of these people were utterly mad. Um, I've come to realize that, in fact, very recently, since I've written the book, I read a book by Justin Hopper called The Old Weird Albion, which is a great book. And he talks about crop circles, which I don't discuss, and how people do genuinely sit in the middle of a crop circle, which is entirely man-made. We know who made certain crop circles. It may not be wide public knowledge, but certain people have put their hands up to these things publicly and privately. But it doesn't mean that people sitting in a crop circle don't see strange lights or experience strange out-of-body experiences. It may be entirely cynically and man-made, but there is something mystical or spiritual, excuse me, that people can get out of these experiences. And again, very, very recently, I was watching a video of Alan Moore talking to Stuart Lee, and I was going to write, one of my essays in the book was going to be about people who believe in magic, because that strikes me as entirely analogous to people who believe in the traditional religions. Although most magicians or people who believe in magic that I've talked to are horrified by any such suggestion. But it's faith in something which, again, that can't be proved. And I was listening to Alan Moore talking about magic and initially thinking, the man is bonkers. But then he pointed out that magic isn't something that can magically get you a wonderful partner or double the amount of money in your bank account. It's an inner process. And I think I've come to be more tolerant of the idea that there is so much that can be got out of faiths and even myths that isn't necessarily the way that they're intended. People do get a lot of comfort from these things and a lot of insight from these things, even if they can be demolished in argument, or the sort of the framework can be demolished. And yeah, I think I'm a lot more tolerant than I was. I will admit to being very intolerant when I was younger, but fascinated.
Very intolerant, but fascinated.
Yeah, yeah.
You were also reading Crowley at that time.
Not seriously. No, no. I mean, I've come across Crowley, and I know quite a few people who take him very seriously. Crowley is just one of those larger than life figures. Obviously had huge influence and still influences people now. But no, I think he was up there with Lobsang Rampa in many respects.
Why this juxtaposition of incredulity and fascination?
I think perhaps part of it is the same way that I'm fascinated, or I was fascinated by the Loch Ness Monster or Uri Geller or Bigfoot, which, I mean, those of us, I mean, I'm 58 now, in the late 70s, early 80s, it was fairly mainstream. Uri Geller was being interviewed on the telly and showing us his fork bending until probably the mid 80s, until people realized it was a little bit silly. And you could have programs about the Loch Ness Monster. And now it's the sort of the far reaches of digital TV stations. You get programs about this, but it's no longer mainstream. So part of it is just fascination with the weird and the strange. But I think it's also because I've known people who I have a great deal of respect for, who hold some of these beliefs. And I think personally, I'm trying to work out my relationship to those people. Because if someone comes along and tells me that they believe in the hollow earth, and I've not met anyone who believes in that, I think I'm going to really doubt their judgment on anything else. But I do know people who have slightly more mainstream beliefs, but there's still things which I don't understand why they could possibly believe. And they're people, as I say, I have a great deal of respect for, love for, some are family members. And it's difficult. It's difficult.
I have a podcast interviewing people who hold religious beliefs, quite a range of religious beliefs, lots of Buddhists, Tibetan Buddhists, Zen Buddhists, and so on. And often people who have converted to Buddhism and become professional Buddhists, Zen teachers with the robes and all that kind of thing, or really immerse their life in it. Also, I've interviewed several occultists, people who do believe, as you pointed out, that magic is real, that you can conjure up demons through Goetia, etc., or astrally travel, or do these sorts of things. And I'm also fascinated by this capacity for suspension of disbelief, i.e. faith. And suspension of disbelief, it's often presented by my guests as a necessary step to be exposed to the evidence that justifies that belief. In other words, you've got to give it a go and give it a chance before you can experience the evidence, the sensory evidence that will convince you that this is real. But of course, as you point out in this book, one tends to find what one wants to find, yeah. Especially in the matter of belief, when there's emotion and psychological need there. And as you perhaps point out, maybe one religion is as good as another to get certain nutrients of meaning and purpose and comfort. You said that religion gives these nutrients, if we can call it that, psychological nutrients, and sometimes that's not what they're intended to do, but that's what people get out of it. I wonder if you think there's a better route, to a more direct, overt route to obtaining those psychological nutrients of meaning and comfort and so on, rather than getting them, in a certain sense, secondarily through a religious faith?
Um, I wish I knew. It would be lovely if there was especially if there was a very easy secular way of doing that. Um, I, I mean, I do think that there are certain things like love and respect and things like that, which cut across all religions and all faiths, or all decent ones anyway. There are some that do their best to subvert that. Um, but at the end of the day, yeah, I think we're all looking for meaning, and we all need meaning to a different degree, and we all have different things that we want explained. And yeah, we are very lucky if we go through our life not needing the human existence really explained to us. But at some point, we all do. We all come across those things like um, death, where we want to know what happens next. I remember my grandfather saying that when he died, he just wanted to be tipped into a ditch and left. He just felt that was it. That's the end. I call myself an agnostic rather than atheist, although I think I'm pretty close to being atheist, because I can't really believe that is the end. I can't believe that in all the millennia, that the Earth has been around, we are here right now. Why did this not happen some time ago, and why am I actually here? I know it's incredibly egocentric to look at it like that, but we can't see these things from any other direction really than from within our own heads looking out. No, I'd love there to be this a non-spiritual easy nutrient that was available. I mean, some people find it through science, an explanation of the world through astrophysics, and the best of luck to them. At the very least, they can turn around and point to facts and figures and show why they've come to their conclusions, and it can be proved. It's more difficult for those who have faith to turn around and explain to others who don't have that faith why they should be listened to. No, if you come across the easy solution, then do let me know.
One of the arguments that I think people of faith might deploy in the conversation like this is, well, we all have faith in something. We all orient ourselves in terms of meaning somehow. If it's not religion explicitly, well, that's a cult because of our cultural moment. That's not really. I mean, to be religious is to be a bit, I think, strange. Most people consider a really truly religious person. Maybe I'm talking from a bit of a UK perspective here. It's a strange thing to meet a very committed Christian or a very committed Buddhist. It's an odd thing. I don't mean a bad thing, but it's unusual to meet someone. Most people don't claim that sort of thing. But a man of faith might say, well, you're invested in other belief systems, other orientations that perhaps to you seem commonsensical or identical with reality, straightforward, cultural or national or philosophical positions that you hold. Some people look for meaning in tradition, Homer and Plato and whatever. Some people look for meaning in a national identity, or some people look for meaning in a kind of post-history liberal project of universal peace and harmony, etc., etc. And that is as much a faith position as, let's say, Buddhism or maybe occultism or something like that, to name a few that we've talked about. What do you think about that?
On a day-to-day basis, yes, absolutely. I suppose there are a lot of sort of secular things that we use to orientate ourselves in existence. My background is very much, I went to an ordinary comprehensive school. I was taught about the scientific process of coming up with a theory and then testing it. And if it works, you go with it. And that worked with religion for a long time because there was very little else to be suggested. And the idea that we go around the sun rather than the other way around, I can understand why that was so difficult. There came a point where it really couldn't be contested. And this is all absolutely fascinating. And then I then bring into the mix in my own mind people like Lobsang Rampa, who, I mean, I came across him when I was about 13. I bought this actual book because it appeared to have an explanation of all kinds of mystical and occult ideas, which I wanted to read about. What I didn't get on with was Rampa's writing style. He's no great stylist, but he also seems to believe everything. And I then swapped the book. This is just as bonkers, but this is Wilson and Grant's Directory of Possibilities, which has everything from spontaneous human combustion to, the world faiths. And I forgot about Rampa, but I assumed that he was. I assumed that he was just a slightly strange Buddhist telling stories, trying to explain the world. I didn't know his backstory, and I think a lot of people these days, and a lot of people do still believe everything that he writes or wrote, don't know his backstory. So when I bought Cults of Unreason, which is a great book by Dr. Christopher Evans, which I bought because I wanted to read about Scientology. This was just before there were lots of fascinating documentaries on the telly about the subject. I found Rampa in there and realized that he was, in fact, a fraud. And it really got me thinking, why do people, I can understand why you believe in Buddhism or why you believe in Christianity, whether that's the faith you've been brought up in or you've come across it later in life and decided that that actually is the answer for you and you'll embrace it. There is this wealth of tradition, and a lot of people have discussed it, and great minds have thought about this for so long. But Rampa was actually a fraudster. He claims that he was a Tibetan Lama, and then suddenly the newspapers revealed that he was the son of a plumber from Plympton in Devon, and he was previously unemployed, and he had never left the country, and he had made the whole thing up. His first edition of The Third Eye, he claims that he had had his third eye physically opened, and for 2 years it was a bestseller. He made it was calculated at the time that he made what we would say is about £1 million worth of royalties out of this book, and he was composing his sequel. And the world's press descended on him, and stories were written about his background, and it was a big story, not just here. I think the Daily Express and the Daily Mail wrote about it here with lots of pictures. I've got press cuttings from Der Stern in Germany and Time magazine in America, because he was translated into so many different languages. And he just, well, he doubled down on his imposture, really. Took him a while. I actually found it, what I find really fascinating is there were 2 or 3 days when he was outed in the press where he was working on his explanation. And it took him a little while to sort it out. And he then refined it in later books. He tells a story, but he has to get the dates a little bit different to make sure they work. And he streamlines it because his early version of the story requires, well, he describes how he was cutting his lawn and the trouble he has cutting his lawn. And he realized that maybe that wasn't that relevant. But he was up a tree trying to photograph an owl, having been cutting the lawn, fell out of the tree. When he came to, there were levitating llamas in his back garden who explained to him that they would like, his name was Cyril, but they wanted Tuesday Lobsang Rampa to transmigrate into his body. He didn't have much of a life at the time. He'd even been considering suicide. He would be allowed to go to, into paradise, basically. They would take over his body. Therefore, the book had been written by Tuesday Lobsang Rampa, a Tibetan Lama. Preposterous story that everyone laughed at the time, apart from a small percentage of people who said, oh, that's it, it's transmigration, sorted. And they've carried on believing him and buying his books. And give it 2 or 3 years, people were buying these books and not knowing that backstory. And they got a lot out of his books. And This is what really fascinates me. A bit like sitting in a crop circle, which has been man-made, but having a mystical experience, people were reading Rampa, who was a hoaxer, but getting a lot from his books and genuinely feeling that they'd learned something. Um, because they were looking for certain things and he appeared to have those answers. Does that make his work any less, or his claims any less relevant? Well, I think they do. Um, and it's a bit like I was interested in von Däniken back in the day. And von Däniken was very clever. Chariots of the Gods, most people forget, had a question mark at the end. He always said, because people would come to him and say, you'll be interviewed, and they would say, your books say that we don't know how they made the Easter Island heads, or why, or the pyramids. And he would say, yes, that's why I'm discussing in my book the possibility that they were created with the help of extraterrestrials. And the interviewer would say, but we do know how they were made. We actually, the archaeologists have found the tools, they found the evidence, they've recreated it, and we do know why. There is a record. And he will say, I'm just asking the question. He was the other thing about von Däniken is that he was convicted for fraud before he became a best-selling author. Should you trust someone who's convicted of fraud? Doesn't mean you should distrust them, but it does mean that you might want to take their pronouncements with a certain amount of healthy skepticism. Doesn't mean they can't give you something that is useful. But I think a Puritan in me doesn't want to believe a word they say afterwards and not trust them. So I'm quite impressed that people do trust them.
You describe in your book the transformation of Cyril Hoskin. He took on another name before the alleged transformation into T Lobsang Rampa. So I wonder if you might plot that trajectory a little bit. And also, do you have any reflections on why he did that, or what was going on there?
Well, it's one of those things that biographer, I think I've only ever written one other biography. I wrote a biography of Robert Aikman, and I had questions I wanted answered. And I answered some of them, and others I never got to the bottom of. And with Rampa, I think, or Cyril Hoskin, as he was previously known, I wanted to know why he had taken on this persona. And I found more information, but I still didn't quite get to the answer. We know that he became interested in, well, as far as I know, Buddhism, but I think it might have just been the East, because one day he turned up at work and insisted that his employer called him KuanSuo. And he started affecting Eastern dress. And I don't think he had necessarily any particular anything particular in mind, other than he must have been fascinated. He obviously did know a fair amount about Tibet and the East. But whether it was more of a Chinese thing than a Tibetan thing, I don't know. But he was, frankly, had led his life as a bit of a loser. He was ill at various times in his life, and I think most of his life he was quite poorly. He was never on the verge of death, which he claimed at various times when he was asked awkward questions. But he'd been unemployed at various times. He'd had various jobs. He'd had run-ins with the law. He always claimed it was never his fault. When he started calling himself KuanSuo, I think he lost his job over it. But my impression is that people started treating him differently. So he started calling himself Dr. Karl Kuan. And as Dr. Karl Kuan, people were deferential. They assumed that the title doctor was something he'd earned properly, which I don't think he did, because he started calling himself a doctor before even the transmigrations meant to have taken place. And there was an air of mystery about him, and suddenly he became an important person. And I think the psychology is sort of fairly obvious that it made him important. And when he wrote his book, The Third Eye is pretty well written. I think it might have been ghost written. I can't find any evidence of this. It's purely that his later books are so badly written. And it was a persona that he moved into, but he must always have known, he must always have got up in the morning thinking, oh yes, I'm Cyril Hoskin. Oh no, hang on, I'm Dr. KuanSuo. And he got very confused when he was exposed as Cyril Hoskin in the newspapers, because he had written the book at a time when his name was actually Dr. KuanSuo. And he had to explain how the book had appeared and how it had come about. So at one point, he and his wife told the world that they had written it on behalf of Lobsang Rampa or KuanSuo, who's because they were on the run from Chinese communism, they couldn't really reveal where this chap was. And no, he wasn't available for interview. That was an early version of the story before they came up with Transmigration. It's all very confused and muddled because at that point he was KuanSuo, but later he would change his name legally, I think, while he was in Canada. He had problems with receiving his royalties and post, I think, so he had to actually change his name to the one that was on the checks. And from then on, he was Lobsang Rampa, and I always think of him as Rampa because, yeah, we give him the name that he assumed in later life and give him the dignity of that. But I think it was a gradual thing. He just found that, yeah, people had more time for him and he had more success with this other persona. One of the things that is again fascinating about him is that in later life, I can find no record of him ever coming out of character. He was always Lobsang Rampa. Not that he had many friends or many opportunities for people to catch him out. He moved to Canada. The idea was that he hated the taxman in Britain, so he moved to Ireland. He then realized that the tax regime in Ireland was just as bad as in Britain, so he moved to Canada and then found that Canada was just as bad as anywhere else. He had a peripatetic life moving between various addresses in Canada, and I can only find one proper friend in his life on the record, and they were only friends for a few months because there came a point where the local newspaper, I'm not sure, I think they were in Calgary at the time, wrote an article about Lobsang Rampa, local resident, absolute fraud, real name Cyril. And he asked his friend, who was a Canadian broadcaster, Alan Stanky, asked him to write to the newspaper to say that he believed Rampa and his story. And Stanky said, "You're a friend, and I'm happy to talk to you as a Lobsang Rampa and listen to you. I don't want to go on record as saying I believe you." And Rampa said, "That's absolutely fine. We can no longer be friends." So his way of not being caught out was he didn't subject himself to interviews. He didn't talk to people. He was criticized throughout his life. He would only answer criticisms within the confines of the books that he was publishing, where he could say what he wanted to say and portray the ignorant questions in the way that he wanted to portray them. So there must have been a certain amount of insecurity, but it made him money, and it gave him a lifestyle. And I think genuinely he was fascinated by I would say, an Eastern way of life. One of the fascinating things about him is he's meant to be a medical Lama, and his story is all about his medical training. And yes, he learns more than just, I mean, I think at that time, Tibetan medicine was mainly to do with herbs. He learned so much more. But when you look into all the things that he says in his books, he's taken it all direct from Madame Blavatsky's Theosophical Society. It's not Buddhist teaching. So yeah, he's just endlessly fascinating. I mean, I would love to have not met him, I don't think. I think there's a great play to be written. There should have been a play for today back in the 1960s about the 3 or 4 days in Howth in Ireland when the world's press were at his door and him and his wife and his secretary were sort of hiding in the house trying to get their story straight.
You mentioned that these books were very popular indeed.
Yeah.
One of the groups among whom the Third Eye was influential is Tibetan Buddhist scholars. Not the scholars of the day. Hugh Richardson, Snellgrove, etc., were quite quick to call the hoax, actually. But several Tibetan Buddhist scholars. You report, Lopez reporting this, became initially interested in Tibet by reading Lobsang Rampa.
Absolutely. In fact, I had an email just the other day from someone who'd read the book saying that he remembers reading The Third Eye, being fascinated by it, going to university and joining the Buddhist Society, being a bit confused, and a real Tibetan Lama turned up to give a talk, and he asked him about the third eye, and the Lama said, "No, it's Western rubbish." The third eye does play a very small part in, I think, Buddhist teaching, not just Tibetan Buddhist teaching, but it's not important, and it's more of a spiritual idea. Whereas Rampa said, no, this is a physical operation that is undertaken to open your third eye. And this chap said he was astounded and confused, but he carried on with his interest in Buddhism. And there appear to be quite a lot of people who converted to Buddhism as a result of an interest sparked by Rampa. And I mean, one of the obvious things that was done back in the day and throughout Rampa's life was people would write to the Dalai Lama, because Rampa claimed to have been a protege of the Dalai Lama. And they would say, is this guy genuine? And the Dalai Lama's, usually his secretary, would write back and say, thank you for your interest. No, we consider him to be a hoaxer, but we do thank him for sparking an interest in Buddhism and also the cause of Tibet. So yeah, a lot of people look back, a lot of committed Western Buddhists weren't brought up in that tradition, have now adopted it through Rampa.
You reference Lopez's Prisoners of Shangri-La quite often throughout the book. And he's written there and elsewhere also his essay in Imagining Tibet about the mystifiers. Considers Lobsang Rampa among them. And he asks some provocative questions in that essay, one of which is, can we really call Lobsang Rampa a fraud if, as it seems those close to him reported, now we can of course doubt that, he really believed that he was Lobsang Rampa. Now you're saying that you think that when he goes to sleep at night, puts his head in the pillow and wakes up in the morning, he knows he's not, deep down somehow, somewhere, maybe not that deep, he knows that he's not that. But even if we take your reading, that's still remarkably sustained transformation of identity, a lifetime. I mean, it's the question that's asked, C.S. Lewis asks of Jesus, isn't it? There's several possibilities. He's a liar, he's delusional, or he's the Son of God. So what do you think of Lopez's opening up that question with Lobsang Rampa?
I think it's an entirely reasonable question, and I can't give an answer to that. I don't think anyone can. I don't even know if Mrs. Rampa could have answered that question. When he was exposed by the press, there was a bigger picture of his secretary on the page in the newspaper than there was a picture of him. She was horrified, and she, in her later memoirs, said that all kinds of sexual impropriety was that they were accused of by the press. Well, they didn't when you read it, but that was kind of the implication, because she was there and she was young, and she followed him for just about the rest of her life. I really get the impression her memoirs are quite naive in many respects, but I think she genuinely believed him. She must have been as horrified as anyone when she heard that his real name was Cyril Hoskin, and he would have had to have admitted to her that he was Cyril Hoskin in a previous life, or physically. She went along with that. She believed him, and I think that belief was genuine. I don't understand how Mrs. Rampa, in her memoirs, takes it so, I mean, she takes it very well, that one day her husband is mowing the lawn, and she goes out because she hears him fall from a tree, and suddenly he says, no, I'm Tuesday Lobsang Rampa. Your husband is gone. And questions are asked of Rampa quite frequently. Do you have sexual relations with your wife? And he would say, no. it has been, let me explain that, monks and nuns in Tibet can live alongside each other without there being any sex. That isn't actually the case. Again, he doesn't know anything about Tibet. They do live separately in Tibet. But she took that really well. It may well be that their relationship wasn't as interesting as it could have been. And she went along with the story. Or did she help cook up the story? I've no idea. And I don't think Rampa was ever inclined to, come clean if it was a lie. And the whole thing was very, very awkward, having been exposed as Cyril Hoskin. I don't know. Did he believe it? I mean, he may well have convinced himself. I don't know. The other interesting question is, and I hopefully, if I had met Rampa, I would have accorded him the respect of calling him Lobsang Rampa, not Cyril Hoskin, in the same way that if someone decides they want to change sex, I would have absolutely no problem with respecting that, in the same way of a Christian becoming a Buddhist. That's your point of view. But a lot of people who have a change of heart about all kinds of things will admit their history. I understand that's awkward in some cases, and in Rampa's case, it was incredibly awkward, because he required you to believe not that he had made a decision. If he had said, I'm a Westerner, an Englishman, and I have adopted a Tibetan Buddhist belief system and way of life, and this is how I now see the world, no one could have any arguments with him discussing transmigration as a concept, which does appear in Buddhism. It's just that there is so much. For example, if you're arrested and the police say, if you say something or you fail to say something which you later rely on in court, we're going to read that a certain way. Rampa fell into that trap. He should really have talked about transmigration before he was forced to come up with an explanation. It's not a smoking gun, but like a lot of things in Rampa's story, it's yet another thing which just doesn't look good if you want to believe him.
Lopez remarks, and I think you point out also, that this idea of a forceful consciousness projection from one body to another, usually from a living body into a recent corpse, is a technique of Tantric Buddhism, and then you sort of occupy it in pretty much the similar way that Lobsang Rampa describes. And so it's a standard Tantric technique, let's put it that way. Now, I say standard, I'm not saying that we see it occur every day, but it's not...
It's an acknowledged technique within Buddhism, yes, yeah.
Right. And Lopez also points out that there are other, he calls them pious fictions that are sometimes maintained. For example, the idea of treasure texts, this idea that revelatory texts that have been hidden in the mind stream or in a rock or something in past lives are then revealed later, and that they're pulled out of a rock or they're pulled out of a sort of zip file in the mind stream, and that he says Tibetan studies scholars maintain a kind of deference to that idea, perhaps from some sense of cultural respect or so, maybe even from a sense of belief or a sense of who knows, of maybe. And particularly, I think, when one looks a treasure revealer in the face and hears them claim with all sincerity, it seems, that that's what's happened, that they've done that. And those people are around. Unlike consciousness projection and so on, which perhaps a bit more difficult to track down, there are plenty of treasure revealers around, and they will tell you that they were, they pulled this from the mind stream, or they took it out of a rock or a lake or so. And many people, I've interviewed them, claim to have seen those kinds of miraculous events. So Lopez, somewhat provocatively, I think, is going against questioning, or at least pointing out, maybe, a little bit of inconsistency in denouncing Lobsang Rampa as a fraud, whilst at the same time accepting some of these other mainstream, institutionally backed claims of the miraculous.
I think one of the problems with Lopez's stance, and it's their questions well worth asking, is that he is looking at or giving evidence from a Buddhist point of view and other points of view, kind of forgetting that Rampa never actually explains himself using a Buddhist point of view. He explains that he can pull treasure from anywhere because he can astrally travel and he will consult the Akashic record. Now, the Akashic record does not appear anywhere in Buddhism. It's one of, well, it wasn't Blavatsky herself. It was one of her followers who came up with the idea of the Akashic record, that somewhere, and it's available to only a few adepts, there is a record of everything that's ever happened, everything that's happening right now, and everything that will happen in the future. And all you need is a library card for the Akashic record, and you can go in and consult it. And that is one of the things that Rampa does. He doesn't refer back to the Buddhist tradition of that would as a way of explaining his story. He refers to it in a theosophical tradition. For example, he talks a lot about the silver cord. When he astrally travels, there's a silver cord that binds the body to the astral body. That's not a Buddhist concept. It came out of theosophy. Now, Madame Blavatsky based her thinking very much on Buddhist thinking, but made it her own. And I get the very strong impression that what's happened is that Rampa has read Madame Blavatsky and assumes that it's Buddhist. He either couldn't find or didn't want to read Buddhist texts. He was obviously much taken with their thinking, with Blavatsky's thinking, and assumed that he could pass that off as Buddhist, which suggests that maybe he didn't get all of his knowledge while at a lamasery in Tibet. And again, it's one of those things all the way through his the third eye. And we know that in the third eye, it was submitted to so many readers who found fault with it. And Rampa made corrections to the third eye. It took a long time to get published because it went to lots of different publishers who turned it down and they couldn't agree with what he was doing or saying. And eventually it was published. But it's still full of all those mistakes that Heinrich Harrer and Hugh Richardson found, which showed that he had never been to Tibet. He'd never grown up there. He knew nothing about the Buddhist tradition. I mean, for example, he says that at age 7, it was decided he would become a Lama. And that isn't what happens. You are born a Lama. He talks about doing his lessons and writing on a slate. Children in Tibet didn't write on slates. They had boards which were painted white, and then you wrote on those. He was remembering his childhood as Cyril Hoskin growing up in Plimpton in Devon. And again, this is not really evidence, but there comes a time in his life when he obviously feels really nostalgic for his childhood. And he also has this sense of that he's been hard done by as a young man. Everything went against him. So Lobsang Rampa, the Tibetan Lama, astrally travels to the Akashic record and can access material which otherwise he wouldn't have, which is Cyril Hoskin's childhood memories. So one of the books actually talks about Cyril Hoskin growing up, and it's very heartfelt. Rampa wanted that on the record. Hoskin wanted that on the record. None of that comes from anything other than, or none of that is justified as anything other than a theosophical idea of going to the Akashic record to access that information. So I think Lopez makes a good hand at being fair-minded, looking at other options. But I don't think he necessarily believes Rampa. But it is an interesting analysis he makes, and a very fair and reasonable one that had to be made, really.
And I think offers some critical reflection via Rampa of, well, in Lopez's case, he's targeting Tibet studies, trends in Tibet studies, but also in religious belief in general. Where do we draw the line between implausible and plausible? It's often not always an evidence-based line that we're drawing. often it's institutional. Well, this seems to be associated with an official institution of the religion, this particular claim of the miraculous. So that one I'm willing to accept. But this person's not even Tibetan. He's from Plimpton. That can't be right, etc. But as you pointed out, there's more to it than simply him being from Plimpton. It's the content itself debunks itself.
Yeah, it's one of those things that back in the day, in 1956, when The Third Eye was published, anyone who was serious about Tibet or Buddhism said this book is a fiction. And people today who are serious about it, I mean, one of the people I consulted is Bob Gilbert, who has spent a long time being interested in Tibet and Tibetan studies. And when I mentioned Rampa's name to him first, he was kind of horrified. And I explained that no, I didn't actually follow Rampa's story as being gospel, and he was very happy about this. He is serious about his interest in Tibet, and he said that the problem with Rampa is that he misrepresents a religion and a country, creates a stereotype, and it is one that can be shot down and actually does, in his mind, it does Tibet and Buddhism harm because it's a fiction. It's cultural appropriation in a way that you wouldn't allow other people to do. It's purely because it's a pseudo-religious, mystical argument that he's making that people feel, I've got to accord him a certain amount of respect. If it hadn't been that, I don't know what example it would be, but if someone was to say they came from a completely different country and were selling cars and misrepresented themselves, you would just write them off. But because we are inclined, and quite rightly should give people's religious beliefs, respect and consider them properly, he perhaps gets an easier ride than other fraudsters who all they want to do is raid your bank account or steal your property. I mean, Rampa is only really guilty of taking 75p off you back in the day when this was published, and you should really have known better at that point. Has he done any harm? Bob Gilbert says yes. He harms the Tibetan cause. The Dalai Lama's people actually said not necessarily. He's raised awareness of Tibet.
A name you don't mention in the book, but who I'd be very curious to hear your comparison or thoughts of in comparison with Rampa, is Carlos Castaneda.
I know very little about Castaneda. As I was writing the book, the name came up a number of times, and I know very little beyond what I've Googled about Castaneda.
Some would say that, much like Rampa, he's a sort of hoaxer who, in doubling down on his hoax, and this is perhaps somewhat unlike Rampa, developed quite a convincing esoteric system. Convincing in the sense that it convinced people. I'm not myself convinced by it, but that it convinced people, and they had organization, and they had, he had, just as Rampa did, a close group of ladies around him and so on, and he was, I think, more successful than Rampa in propagating his particular idea, and which was seen initially as accurate and true and right, and then later sort of debunked. But today, I think, more than Rampa, people still buy the Castaneda, and many, many people I've interviewed were very moved by Castaneda's writings, tried the techniques, felt that they worked, etc., etc. So he's an even more complicated example of the sort of dynamic Rampa has.
Yeah, and I don't think when people start out, whether it's Castaneda or Rampa or even Raynor Winn, who's anyone watching this in the future might not realize that as we speak, there's a bit of controversy over someone who's written a book. There are some details that are wrong, and she's been taken to task for it in her book, where she talks about leaving her home and going for a walk, and with her husband who is ill. A lot of people are angry that she's misrepresented certain things. I can't help thinking, as a writer myself, and I've written some autobiographical stuff, that she probably didn't know how big the book was going to be. And she may well have exaggerated, and she may well have changed things, and yeah, to make it a more compelling story. She wrote it under a pseudonym. She probably didn't think that people would go checking for all the details. People are very, very angry because they took the book to heart and they feel let down. There is a problem because she is essentially trying to suggest that against all the odds, they went for a long walk in nature and it did them good. The implication is that you can also be done good by going for a long walk in nature. And of course you can, but it won't necessarily cure the medical problems that she talks about. And her whole reason for going on the walk has been misrepresented, and the people who know her backstory are obviously angry about it. In the same way with Rampa, people were angry that he had fictionalized a lot of the, what goes on in Tibet. They were going to make him pay for that. He probably didn't realize that people were going to look into it in any great detail. But any writer must, even if they don't think they're going to be a bestseller, be of interest, they've got to hope they're going to be a bestseller. They're going to hope that they're going to sell enough books and interest enough people. And no writer has the ambition to sort of just get across the financial line with their latest book. They want to be, accepted as someone who's written a good book, which means something to people. And those small lies can mean a hell of a lot to people, even if they weren't really necessarily meant to deceive. And Rampa, he was offered the chance to publish The Third Eye as fiction because his publishers frankly didn't believe him, but he insisted, no, it had to be sold as fact, which was in many ways quite a sensible thing to do. It made for more sales because it was so revealing of all the hidden secrets of Tibet in a way that fiction wouldn't necessarily. So yeah, there are a few small decisions made early on in the lives of some of these people who we would call fraudsters and hoaxers. And they set in motion a juggernaut, which they didn't really expect necessarily to going in that direction or for so long, or they couldn't get off the juggernaut. It was traveling too fast.
What's that saying about webs weaving, deceiving?
Yeah, and it's yeah, it would be interesting to know the initial intentions of certain people who, whether they've been revealed as fraudsters or hoaxers or not, when they end up creating systems which people believe. For example, crop circles in modern times. There have obviously been not much of one, but there's a bit of a history of crop circles going back a couple of centuries. But then there's always been people who have been really annoyed with their neighboring farmer and have done some damage. The initial people who created crop circles did it for a bit of fun, and were quite annoyed when their first crop circles weren't noticed, and then pleased because their initial crop circles weren't very good. And then when they became, photographed and in the newspapers, they kind of felt they had done their thing and were presumably slightly worried, and they have gone on the record. What came along afterwards were people who saw it as basically an art project. And I know one of the people personally who saw it as an art project and was associated with all that. And when frankly, it was Reg Presley from the Trogs was announced in the newspapers as contributing £1 million to crop circle studies. This particular person said, actually, at this point, I'm going to step back because this is getting a bit, it's getting way too serious and silly. I want nothing more to do with this. So yeah, what can start off as a bit of a fun or something just to get a book published to make some money, which was also Mrs. Rampa's initial explanation to the newspapers. They were hard up and they needed some cash, can have far-reaching repercussions.
Well, this is T Lobsang Rampa and Other Characters of Questionable Faith by R.B. Russell, available from Tartarus Press. I wonder if you might, as we, I think, perhaps come towards the end of our conversation, say something about Tartarus Press.
Well, I say we, initially it was just myself trying to make available some texts by Arthur Machen to a few other Arthur Machen enthusiasts. And I realized that rather than printing stuff off my own, daisy wheel printer, I would get things photocopied and I made them to little booklets. And there was a small demand. I was basically running a press without thinking about it, and it became more serious. And I realized that I was enjoying it. And my wife, Rosalie, joined Tartarus in the sort of mid-90s, and eventually gave up her job. And we've been running it ever since. And we've always wanted to publish the stuff that we like. We've always worked on the theory that if we like it, then hopefully other people will. And if no one else does, at least we can say we published it because we thought it was great, and we don't mind having 300 copies under the bed because it's such a great book. And somehow, over the years, we have managed to publish quite a few writers who've gone on to have careers, won a few awards. And at some point, I do feel I ought to get down to doing a proper job. I work harder than I've ever done in any other jobs I had when I was younger. But it does still feel like a bit of a hobby that I enjoy doing. And at some point, I'll join the real world. And in the meantime, we publish sort of 8 or 9 books a year, and thoroughly enjoy doing it.
Why Tartarus?
I was living in Sheffield at the time that I needed a name for the press, and I was in Sheffield City Library reading, because I was publishing Machen. I found some of the articles he wrote in the First World War, and I found an article where he talks about being in Sheffield, and he describes it as being like Tartarus, one of the regions of hell. It was meant in an affectionate way. Machen was a great drinker, and he turned up in Sheffield, he'd been around various cities where there was blackout, but in Sheffield they had the great blast furnaces going. There's absolutely no point in having blackout. So the whole place glowed red. And what he saw were steelworkers leaving work and piling into the pubs where they were desperate to put back fluid because they had been sweating for a very long shift. They were all on sort of double and triple time to make munitions for the war. So they were drinking like he'd never seen anyone drink. I don't think he realized that the local sort of Stones bitter is actually quite weak in Sheffield. It's because it was used for putting back fluids, not necessarily getting drunk. And Machen thought it was wonderful. It was in the midst of war, when the whole of the country was being very miserable and in blackout, Sheffield was highly illuminated, and the pubs were full of blokes appearing to have a good time. He called it, said it was like being in Tartarus. So I couldn't not use that name.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I must say, in terms of Machen, I've read The Great God Pan, of course.
Yeah.
But that's it. And
Right.
perhaps I could tempt you back for a second conversation in some weeks or months or so about Machen, actually.
I'd love to. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and in which case I might solicit you for something of a reading list
Sure.
ahead of it. Maybe you've got that somewhere laying around. Machen for the Great God Pan only, the lowest rung of the initiatory order of Machen.
No, it's an important rung. And it's certainly not the lowest. I mean, it's a good horror story for the 1890s. He was out to shock people, and he succeeded. But he also wrote much more reflective, mystical fiction. And some of his best work is writing about. He had this idea that there was a romantic idea. I don't think he had any proof that there was an original early Welsh church, Christian church, that remained hidden away. So when the Holy Grail comes back, it will, of course, come to the people of Wales, and it will be the lowly folk of Wales. So yeah, lots of interesting stuff. And he's been taken up by psychogeographers for his later work. I love his autobiographical fiction, which is beautifully written. Yeah, a very wide-ranging author. Great God Pan is only a part of it. But
When I say it's the lowest rung, I don't mean quality-wise, I mean, that if anyone's read any Machen at all, if they've only read one thing, it'll have been that.
Yeah. It's his most widely anthologized story, definitely. Yeah.
Great. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. And of course, all the links to Tartarus Press are down below. And this is a limited run, I understand, 300.
At the moment, yes. Yeah, there's 300 copies, but there's an ebook available as well. And we're hoping there will be a paperback in due course.
So now's the time to snap it up, get it while it's going, so to speak. R.B. Russell, this is fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.